Hi all, welcome back to the complete React Material UI tutorial. So this is the fourth video in this series of videos where we discuss how to implement form validation and how to insert a new record inside the form submit event. Validation will be done for entire form as a whole and also we will do the validation for single control for each key press. Finally, after successful validation, we will insert a new record into data storage. Before starting this video, I would like to thank for your PayPal donations for my previous works. In order to make more helpful and quality tutorials like this, you can also support me through PayPal donation. I have given the link in video description and inside the first comment of this video. So without further ado, let's get started with this topic. Here we have the final output from previous tutorial where we have discussed how to create or design a Material UI form with all common input controls. All of the video links from this series will be there in video description and inside the first comment of this video. So in this tutorial, we will cover everything related to Material UI form validation. So these are the validations that I am planning to implement here. This full name should be mandatory. Email is not mandatory, but if there is something inside that, it should be in proper email format. In case of mobile, there should be more than 9 numbers, and finally there should be one department selected for the employee. So let's look how to implement these validations. So here we have the same project that we have left from previous tutorial. For all of the controls inside the form, we have used reusable components that we have discussed in previous tutorial. We have created the text field for these controls: full name, email and mobile. So which is the inside this component input with the help of Material UI component text field. Now let's check what we have got inside the Material UI documentation here. As per the documentation here, with this error property we can toggle the error state, and with the help of this property helper text we can show this feedback here. For example, let's check this example here. So let me expand the source code. So here we have the corresponding text field. First of all, we have to set this property error as true for showing the error, and corresponding error message will be there inside this property helper text. You could do the same inside this text field also. First of all, we just need to set this property error and then helper text. Inside this property, we will be showing some validation error. Now you could see the change inside this form here. All of these text field components are in error state. Just below that you could see the error message. Now let's look how to implement validation as per our requirement. We have designed the form inside this employee form component here. So first of all, I'm going to define a function for validation. So here is the function validate. For now we don't have any parameter for this function. First of all, we have this input control for full name. It is mandatory to submit this form. So let's look how to implement the required validation for this control full name. For that, first of all, I will define an object like this temp. Inside this temp object, we will be saving the validation error message. So we can do this temp. Inside that, we will have this property full name. Here we will check the value of full name property inside this state object values. As you know, this form is designed with the values state object here. So we can check the value of full name inside this object. If there is a value inside this property, we don't have any error message. So I will pass the empty string here. We are doing that with ternary operator. Otherwise, we will have this error message. This field is required. Like this, we have to add 3 more validation for email, mobile and department. So I will duplicate this line 3 times using the shortcut Ctrl C then Ctrl V. Now let's define the validation for email property. It is not mandatory, but if there is any value inside this text box here, it should be in proper email format. For that, I will be using a simple regular expression here. The expression starts with the / here. We can allow the user to leave this field empty, so we can use this $symbol here. And here we have the OR operator, meaning if there is something inside the text box, it must have 1 or more character before this @ symbol, and then 1 or more character followed by a period symbol. After that also we need 1 or more character. So this is a simple regular expression for checking email address. We will end this expression with the same / here, and we can call the function test. Inside that we have to pass the email property. If the function returns true, meaning this field is valid, otherwise we will show the error message email is not valid. After that we have mobile. For mobile property we need at least 10 characters. So we will check the length property here. It should be more than 9. Otherwise we will show this message minimum 10 numbers required. And finally we have this department drop down here. We have designed that with this property department ID. Selected department ID will be stored inside this property here. So we can check the property department ID. So let's do that here. By default it will be an empty string. So we can check that here with the length. If length is not equal to 0, we will show the same error message, this field is required. So inside this function we have defined the validation for form controls, and we have saved the error message inside this object temp. We have to have a component state property for saving these error messages that we can do inside this component use form, where we have defined the values object here. Just below that I will define the errors object also. So let me duplicate this, errors, then set errors. Initially it will be an empty object like this, and from this function use form we will return the object errors and set errors. We can access that inside the employee form component here, errors, then set errors. Now inside this validate function we can save the errors from this object into this state object errors here. For that we just need to call this set errors function, and inside that we can have this object. With the help of separator operator we can save those error messages into the errors state object. Now we have to call this function somewhere inside this component. We will do that while submitting this form here. We have not yet added a submit event for the form. Let's do that here. For designing this form we have used this reusable component form. This is not the HTML form. We have created a reusable form inside this file here, use form. We have discussed various benefits of using reusable components inside the application in previous tutorial. Now let's look how to add the onSubmit event. For that I will just add the onSubmit event here. OnSubmit is equal to, we will be defining a function handle submit. Okay, let it be here, handle submit. For now I will leave this function as empty. Now this is a reusable component. Into that we have passed this property onSubmit. We have to assign this into this HTML form here. For that we can use the destructive syntax like this. First of all we will have the children property. So children, this children property refers to the child component inside the form here, and rest of the properties will be there inside this other property. We can use this separator operator here, and we just need to assign the props here. So the onSubmit property that we have passed here will be there inside this other property here. Now we have to assign that into this form here. For that we just need to do this other. Now if you want to check whether this event works or not, we can call this alert function here. Let me save this back to the application, submit the form. That's it. Now let's call this validate function inside the form here. I will do that inside this if statement here, validate. So this validate function must return a boolean value indicating whether the form as a whole is valid or not. For that we want to modify this function a bit. We will have this return statement first of all, and then we can call this function object.values. Into this we just need to pass the object temp. So this values function returns a collection of values inside this object, which are email, full name, mobile and department. And from that return collection, we will call this function every. Inside this function, we can have this condition. If this function is new to you, you could check this MDN documentation here. The method tests whether all the elements inside the array pass the test implemented by the provided function. So if all of the properties inside this temp object is an empty string, then we could say that this form as a whole is valid. If this condition is true for all of the properties inside the object, then it will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. And thereby we could see this alert here. Let's check that here. Don't look at these error messages. We will fix that accordingly. Now let's try to submit this form. Currently, when we submit the form, this page gets reloaded. We don't have to have the default behavior of the form. So it's there inside the HTML form by default. So let's prevent that. For that, we can have this default parameter E, and then we just need to call the function prevent default. Let's try that again. Now we can't see this alert here because this function returns false. All of these properties are not valid. So let's try after populating these form controls here. Email is not mandatory, so let's move to the mobile number. There should be at least 10 numbers inside that. Let's select a department here, submit the form. That's it. Since we are getting this alert message here, the form as a whole is valid. Now let's remove the selection for the department here, submit the form. Now we can see the alert message since we have some validation error regarding this department. So we have properly defined the validation with this validate function here. Now we have to show validation error message along with respective controls here. So first of all, let's show error messages for these input controls, full name, email, and mobile. After that, we will do the same for this department select drop down here. So back to the employee form. Into these controls, full name, first of all, I will pass this property errors dot full name. We have designed this control inside this reusable component input. Here we don't have the property error that we have passed here. So let's add the property here, error. I will set null as default value here. Now into this component here, we have to set these properties error and helper text dynamically based on the helper message that we have passed from the form. If there is a value for this error property, we have to apply these both properties inside the component here. For that, we can do this. First of all, we will have the curly brace and we can use this separator, and then we can have this pair of parentheses. First of all, we will check this property error. If this property is not null, then we will do the rest of the operations. So we just need to return this object containing these properties error and helper text. So I will do this, error is equal to true, and then we have the helper text, which is there inside the property error that we have passed from the form. So first of all, we will check whether the property is not null or not. If it is not null, then we will return this object containing these two properties error and helper text, and that will be separated here so that these properties error and helper text can become a part of this outer component here. Now let me remove these properties from here. Sorry, here we have to use to and simple. Let me save this and back to the application. Let's check whether it is working or not. Now let's submit the form without full name. Boom. So here we have shown the error message for full name. Now let's provide a name here. Submit the form. Now it works. Now let's do the same for this email and mobile also. Now let's pass this property for email and mobile. Back to the form, submit this. That's it. It's okay to leave this email as empty, but if there is something inside that, it should be in proper format. Let me enter some random text here, submit the form. No, it's not working. There should be some error related to the email here. Let's check the regular expression that we have passed here. yes, here we missed this end symbol, upward arrow, or you could say the caret symbol. So these symbols indicates starting and ending of a string respectively. In between them we don't have any character, meaning it allows empty string. Now back to the application. Let's try that again. Submit the form. Now we have the error. Let's add the domain here at gmail.com. Submit the form. Now it's working. Now let's look how we can show validation error for this select drop down here. As per the MUI documentation here, in order to show the validation error for select control, we have to set the error property for the outer form control. In order to show this helper text, we can have this component form helper text just after this select component here. And so based on the component documentation, whether it is text field, select control, or date picker, whatever it is, you could set these properties dynamically. Now let's look how to show these properties error and this component form helper text inside this application for this department when it is not valid. So first of all, we have to pass this error property here, errors dot department ID. Now back to this select component here. First of all, we will add this property error here. I will set null as default here. Now first of all, we have to set the error property like we have seen here, error. I will do the same like we have done here with the help of this AND operator. So let me copy paste the line here. We have to set this property error as true. Now let me remove this helper text from here. Now let's show this component tag form helper text dynamically. For that, let me copy this from here. We have to add that just below the select control. This MUI select is also the same select control that we have seen here. We have just used this alias MUI select. So first of all, I will have this curly brace. If the value is present inside this error property, we can have this tag form helper text. We can show the error message from the property error. Now let's add the import statement for this component form helper text. You can use the shortcut hold control then press space. Most of the time the auto suggestion without default works. So I will select the second one here. So here we have added the import statement. Now let me save this. Now let's check whether it works or not. Submit the form. That's it. Here we have the error due to department. Now select one department here. Submit the form. Now we don't have any department validation error. So that's how we can implement form validation as a whole. Currently we validate the form only when we submit the form. We have to do the validation for single controls on each key press here. So we will do that in a bit. Before that, let me reset the form. So back to the application. Let's define a function, reset function, inside this reusable component use form here. So here is the function reset form. Inside this, we just need to clear these state objects, values and error. So I will call the corresponding functions set values. Inside that, we could pass these initial field values. We have discussed them in previous tutorial, and then we can call this set errors function. Into that we can pass this empty object. And now let's return this function from this component, and let's access that inside this form here. Because of the reusable components that we have created in previous tutorial, we can just reuse them by calling this use form function like this. Now let's set this function into this reset button here. We have designed that with this reusable component button, which is here. Inside this component we have this property on click for click event. So we just need to pass that function here. On click, we'll just pass the function reset form. So this on click function will be assigned to the button MUI button here. Now let's try that here. Let me enter some random text here. submit the form. We have values and error message inside the form here. Now let's reset the form. Boom. So it works as expected. Now let's look how to implement single control real-time validation. As you might have guessed, in order to do that, we have to call this validate function inside this onChange event of input controls. We have defined this function handle input change inside this reusable component use form here. So first of all, into this component, I will be passing two properties here. Validate onChange, meaning whether we want to implement single control validation on real time or not, so that you can skip this feature for some forms. I will set the default value as false here, and then we can pass the validate function that we have defined inside the form component here. So while calling this function use form, pass true for onChange, and then we have to pass this validate function here. So we want to do the single control real-time validation using this validation that we have defined with the function validate. For that, we have to do some changes inside this handle input change here. So first of all, we will check whether this form asks for this feature for single control validation. So we can check that with this property validate onChange. Inside that, we will call the function validate that we have to define in corresponding form component like employee form. Into this function, we are going to pass an object. So inside this object, we'll be having a single property name. It will be replaced by the control name property from which onChange event is triggered. That will be similar to the name that we have passed here, and value for this property can be accessed from this value here. Now inside the function validate, we have to make few more changes. I will add this new parameter field values. By default, it will be having the values object that we have here. So when we call this function validate from this handle submit event here, even though we are not passing anything here, this parameter will be having this default values containing all of the properties that we have here with respective values. Now we have to add this if statement for each validation. We will check whether this property full name is there inside this field values here in field values. So this is required for single control validation. From this handle input change here, we are just passing an object with a single control value. So we only have to do the validation for that particular control. We have to do the same for rest of the validations here. Email, mobile, and department ID. So the code that we have made inside this submit event here will be same as before. All of these validation will be done since all of these properties will be present inside this field values here. For single control validation, we have to do only one of this validation. That's why we added this if statement here. In that case, if we assign this temp object with an empty object like this, it will clear existing errors inside the form. In order to avoid that, we will save the existing errors inside this temp here, errors, and based on the property that we have passed, it will only update that property for the error message. Okay? And finally, we just need to return this boolean value indicating whether this form as a whole is valid or not. So we have to return this boolean value only when we call this function inside the form submit event here. In order to identify whether we are calling this function from handle input change or submit event, we can have this if statement here, and we will check whether field values is equal to values or not. So I hope you understood everything that we have discussed here. If you have any problem in understanding or implementing these features in your application, let me know in comment box below. Now we have done everything for the single control input validation. Let me save all of these modifications. Let's check whether it is working or not. Let's submit the form without any value. Now let's check whether single control real-time validation works or not. It's not working as we expect, but it works as we keep entering. The reason is pretty much basic. Inside this handle input change function here, we have updated the values object here. But this values object will not be updated immediately after calling this function here. It is an asynchronous function which is mentioned inside the React documentation here. I have given the link in video description, you could check that also. There will be a small delay because this operation is done asynchronously in backend. So we can't depend on this values state object inside this function validate, which is called just after this update set function here. So this update operation won't work immediately after calling this set values function. There will be a delay. So that's the reason for the issue that we have seen here. Just immediately after calling this function, we are calling the validate function. Inside that we are testing or checking the value from the values object. So this operation will be done before updating the value of the property. So in order to avoid this problem, we can use field values instead of values object here. Now this should work as we expect. The value for this parameter field values is passed by directly accessing the value event target here, so it will provide the current value. Now let me enter the first character here. Boom, it works. Now let's try the real-time validation for rest of the controls here. Currently this email field is not valid. Let's complete that with a proper email format, email@gmail.com. Now let's try the same for mobile and for the department also. Submit the form. So here we are getting the alert message, meaning this form is valid now. So that's all about form validation. In next video, we will discuss how to work with data table in Material UI. In order to demonstrate Material UI table with paging, sorting and filtering, we need list of employees. So before winding up this video, we will insert new employees inside the form submit event here. To store this list of employees, I will be using the simplest and easiest method for data storage, which is browser local storage instead of some backend APIs like ASP.NET Core, Node.js, PHP, etc. If you don't know, don't worry, you just need to know these three functions here: set item, get item, remove item. So from this local storage object here, you just need to call this set item function in order to insert a new data. As a first parameter here we have the key and then the value as a second parameter. So for example, with this myCat key we have stored Tom. In order to retrieve this, you just need to call this function get item with the particular key that we have passed while inserting the record. And finally, in order to delete the item, you can call this remove item function with the key. Now back to the submit event here. Inside this submit function here, we just need to insert a new employee from these control values here. For that, first of all, inside this employee service file here, let's add corresponding local storage functions. So first of all, let's define a function for insert operation. Insert employee with a single parameter data containing the form field values. So inside this function, we just need to call this function set item for inserting that particular object. So we will be calling the function like this: local storage set item. As a first parameter, we have to pass the key where we want to save the list of employees. So it would be something like employees and then the object that we have received through this parameter data. So before saving this object, JSON object, into the local storage, we have to convert that into JSON string. So we will be calling this function JSON stringify here, and into that we can pass this object data. Now, as per the best practice, it is recommended to store this string here inside a constant variable so that we can avoid the mistakes of typing this string in various other functions like retrieve or delete operation. So we can do this, define this constant object here, keys. Inside this object, I will have this property employees. Inside that, we can store this string here. Now we just need to do this keys dot employees. Now before defining this insert operation, let me define the function for retrieving all of the employees records that we have saved inside the key employees. So here is the function. I will just paste that function here, get employees. First of all, we will check whether that particular local storage item is already occupied or not. If it is null, we will insert an empty array into that particular key. And finally, from this function, we will return the array of employees. Now inside this insert function here, first of all, I will retrieve all of the employees. We can call this function get all employees here. Into this array of employees, we can insert the new record like this. Just call the function push from the array and we can pass this data here. Now instead of storing this data record into the local storage, we have to save this employees array here. So employees. Now before inserting this record into local storage, we have to have a unique primary key for this data here. Inside local storage, along with list of employees, we will be storing the employee ID for next insert operation. So here is the key for that data, employee ID. So this is similar to the primary key that we used to have in our practical databases. Now before this push operation here, we will generate a unique ID for the record. We will save that with this property ID. To generate the particular ID, we will create another function here, generate employee ID. So inside the function, we will just do this. So first of all, inside the function, we will check whether that particular local storage is already occupied or not. If not, we will save 0 inside the local storage here. Now inside this ID, we will be retrieving that particular ID that we have inside the local storage with the employee ID key. And then we will increment the ID by 1 and we will store that back to the local storage. And finally, from the function, we will return the incremented ID and that we can use here. Generate employee ID function can be called here. So that's all about the insert and retrieve operation here. Rest of the update and delete operation will be done in upcoming tutorials. Sorry, here we have a typo with this function generate employee ID. We have the extra J here, so let me remove that. And also we have to enclose this ID parameter inside single quotes like this. Now let's call this insert function inside this employee form submit event here. We have already imported that particular file up here, employee service. Now let's call the function here, insert employee. Into the function, we just need to pass the value of form controls. For that, we can just pass this values state object here. Back to the application here. Now let's insert a new employee. Finally, submit the form. Now to check whether we have inserted the record into local storage, you can do this. First of all, go to inspect, then application, then inside that you could see this local storage here. Boom. So here we have saved the employees and employee ID as per the form that we have given here. After this insert operation, we forgot to reset the form here. That we can do inside the form submit event here. Reset form. So that's it guys. In this video we have discussed how to validate a React Material UI form, and after all we have inserted the employee record into local storage. In next video we will be dealing with Material UI data table with paging, sorting and filtering. If you found this video helpful, please thumbs up this video, and for more awesome videos like this, please be subscribed to this channel CodAffection. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.